Good morning or good afternoon. So in this video, we will be discussing about the factors that influence exchange rates. After studying this chapter, the learner should be able to meet the following objectives. First is to describe the International Monetary Fund and its role in determining exchange rates. Discuss the major exchange rate arrangements that countries use. Explain the European monetary system and how the euro became the currency of the Eurozone. Identify the major determinants of exchange rates. Show how managers try to forecast exchange rate movements and explain how exchange rate movements influence business decisions. First, we will define exchange rate. Exchange rate represents the number of units of one currency needed to acquire one unit of another. So, in simple definition, exchange rate is the value of one currency for the purpose of conversion to another currency. So, why managers need to understand exchange rate? Such understanding can help them anticipate exchange rate changes and make decisions about business factors that are sensitive to those changes, especially when the business is entering the international business. It can help them to come up with effective decision when it comes to sourcing of raw materials and components, the placement of manufacturing and assembly, and the choice of final markets. Since exchange rate is subject to change from time to time without prior notice, having the enough knowledge about the exchange rate can help the managers to measure and minimize its effect to the business, especially when it comes to their profit in their international business, and also for them to make adjustments about the product. The International Monetary Fund. In 1944, toward the close of World War II, the major Allied governments met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to determine what was needed to bring economic stability and growth to the post-war world. As a result of those meetings, the International Monetary Fund came into official existence on December 27, 1945. With the goal of promoting exchange rate stability and facilitating the international flow of currencies. The IMF began the financial operations on March 1, 1947, and out of 196 countries in the world, 189 is the official member of IMF, and the 7 countries that are not IMF members are Cuba, East Timor, North Korea, Liechtenstein, Monaco, Taiwan, and Vatican City. So, the fundamental mission of the IMF is to promote international monetary cooperation and exchange rate stability, facilitate the balanced growth of international trade, and provide resources to help members in balance of payments difficulties or to assist with poverty reduction. So, the IMF was created to help countries maintain the value of currencies and to avoid the trade barriers and high interest rates that helped cause the Great Depression, which is the severe economic downfall. Bretton Woods and the principle of par value. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a system of fixed exchange rates under which each IMF member country set a par value for its currency based on gold and the US dollar. So, the Bretton Woods Agreement established a system through which a fixed currency rate could be created using gold as the universal standard. It is also known as the dollar-gold standard or gold exchange standard. With the gold standard, countries agreed to convert paper money into a fixed amount of gold. That fixed price is used to determine the value of the currency. The reason why currency is based on gold, since the US dollar is the only convertible currency that is considered to be as good as gold. The primary features of the gold standard were the unlimited convertibility of currencies into gold and high stability facilitated by trade among countries that eliminated exchange rate fluctuations and risk. This system maintained the equilibrium of trade automatically, since gold standard is also non-inflationary because The issuance of money is dependent on states' gold resources. The IMF today, the hot assistant. The sum of the total assessment to each country becomes a pool of money that the IMF can draw on to lend to other countries. It forms the basis for the voting power of each country. The higher its individual quota, the more votes a country has. So quota serves as the building blocks of the IMF's financial and governance structure. A country's quota broadly reflects its relative position in the world economy. So, in short, the quota subscription, which is provided by the member countries of the IMF, is for the IMF generating its funds so that they can lend it to other countries. And quotas are key determinant of voting power in IMF decisions. Based on my research, votes comprise one vote per special drawing rights 100,000 of quota plus basic votes. Assistance programs. In addition to identifying exchange rate regimes, the IMF offers a great deal of aid to member countries, negotiating with them to provide financial assistance if they agree to adopt certain economic stabilization policies. This arrangement is presented in a letter of intent to the executive board of the fund, which upon accepting it, releases the funds in phases so it can monitor progress. This means that the IMF assists countries which are hit by crisis by providing them financial support to help prevent the crisis. Like what is happening today. The Philippine government extend loan support to IMF. IMF provide our government financial assistance and debt service relief in facing the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is equivalent to $1 billion to help our country fight this battle. Special drawing rights. It is an international reserve asset given to each country to help increase its reserve, the unit of account in which the IMF keeps its financial records. The currencies making up the SDR basket are the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. The Chinese renminbi or the yuan was added in 2016. So, before its creation, the international community had to face several restrictions in increasing world trade and the level of financial development as gold and US dollars, which were the only means of trade were in limited quantities. In order to address the issue, SDR was created by the IMF. SDR is often regarded as a basket of national currencies, comprising four major currencies of the world: US dollar, euro, British pound, and yen. SDR allocations can play a role in providing liquidity and supplementing member countries' official reserves, as was the case amid the global financial crisis. Also, it serves as the unit of account of the IMF and some other international organizations. The role of the IMF in global financial crisis. An important responsibility of the IMF is to monitor and assess vulnerabilities of the economic and financial policies of member countries in relation to domestic and global stability. So, the IMF is very important because it serves as the advisor of the member countries on economic and financial policies that promote stability, reduce crisis, and encourage sustained growth and high living standards. With the help of IMF, it monitors global economic trends and developments that affect the health of the international monetary and financial system and promotes communication among member countries on the regional and global consequences of their policies. In addition to these surveillance activities, the IMF provides technical assistance to help strengthen members' institutional capacity and makes resources available to them to facilitate adjustment in the event of a balance of payments crisis. Most importantly, the IMF can provide financial assistance to support policy programs that will correct underlying macroeconomic problems that a country is experiencing, limit disruption to both the domestic and the global economy, and help restore confidence, stability, and growth. The IMF offers precautionary credit lines for countries with sound economic fundamentals for crisis prevention. To floating exchange rates. The IMF system was initially one of fixed exchange rates. Because the US dollar was the cornerstone of the international monetary system, its value remained constant with respect to the value of gold. Other countries could change the value of their currency against gold and the dollar, but the value of the dollar remained fixed. On August 15, 1971, as the U.S. balance of trade deficit continued to worsen, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer trade dollars for gold unless other industrial countries agreed to support a restructuring of the international monetary system. He was afraid that the United States would lose its large gold reserves if countries worried about holding so many dollars, resulting from the large U.S. trade deficit, turned in their dollars to the U.S. government and demanded gold in return. So the evolution of floating exchange rates is the regime of exchange rate in which a currency's value is allowed to fluctuate whether it is rise or fall in response to foreign exchange market events. Then it comes the Smithsonian Agreement. So the Smithsonian Agreement was implemented in December 1971 and paved the way for a new dollar standard as other industrialized countries pegged their currencies to the US dollar. So here are the results of the Smithsonian Agreement. First, an 8% devaluation of the dollar, an official drop in the value of the dollar against gold, which means it reduced the value of dollar. Second, a revaluation of some other currencies, an official increase in the value of each currency against gold. So in here, there is an upward adjustment of the value of a currency in relation to other currencies and they acknowledge other currencies. Third, a widening of exchange rate flexibility from 1 to 2.25% on either side of par value, which means that the prices of foreign exchange determined by the market that can rapidly change due to supply and demand and are not pegged nor controlled by central banks. So, Smithsonian Agreement marked the end of the gold standard, which was enacted in the 1930s. The Smithsonian Agreement only lasted 15 months as speculators drove the dollar lower and countries abandoned the peg in favor of floating exchange rates. The Jamaica Agreement. Because the Bretton Woods Agreement was based on a system of fixed exchange rates and par values, the IMF had to change its rules to accommodate floating exchange rates. The Jamaica Agreement of 1976 amended the original rules to eliminate the concept of par values and permit greater exchange rate flexibility. The Jamaica Agreement of 1976 resulted in greater exchange rate flexibility and eliminated the use of par values. So this agreement changed the original rules to abolish or remove the concept of par values and give authorization and allow the exchange rate flexibility. The move toward greater flexibility can occur on an individual country basis as well as an overall system basis.
So next is the exchange rate agreements. The Jamaica Agreement formalized a break from fixed exchange rate. As part of this move, the IMF began to permit countries to select and maintain an exchange rate agreement of their choice, provided they communicated their decision to the IMF. The formal decision of a country to adopt a particular exchange rate mechanism is called a de jure system. In addition to that, the IMF surveillance program determines the de facto exchange rate system that the country uses. The IMF also consults annually with the countries to see if they are acting openly and responsibly in their exchange rate policies. Each year, each country notifies the IMF of the arrangement it will use, and the IMF uses information provided by the country and evidence of how the country acts in the market to place it in a specific category. The IMF surveillance consultation program are designed to monitor exchange rate policies of countries and to see if they are acting openly and responsibly in exchange rate policies. There are three choices in the exchange rate agreements: the hard peg, soft peg, or the floating arrangement. The hard peg. There are two possibilities for countries that adopt a hard peg. The first is called dollarization. It can occur when the country like Zimbabwe or Ecuador does not have its own currency but has adopted the US dollar as its currency. The second example of the hard peg is the currency board, which is an organization generally separated from a country's central bank that is responsible for issuing domestic currency typically anchored to a foreign currency. There are 12 countries now that has currency board. The one in Hong Kong uses the US dollar as its anchored currency. Even though the Hong Kong dollar is locked into the US dollar, it moves up and down against other countries as the US dollar, which is a floating currency. It also changes in value. Next is the soft peg. There are several different types of soft peg, but most countries in this category, 44 out of 83, have adopted a conventional fixed peg agreement, whereby a country peg its currency to another currency or basket of currency and allow the exchange rate to vary plus or minus 1% from that value. Most countries uses the US dollar and the euro to anchor their pegs. In the other soft peg categories, the degree of flexibility increases, but the IMF determines that the currency are not floating. And lastly is the floating arrangement. Currencies considered to be a floating arrangement are either floating, which consists of 36 countries, or free floating with 29 countries. Floating currency are those that generally change according to market forces but may be subjected to market intervention. Brazil and India, two of the BRIC countries, are considered to have a floating currency. The freely floating currency or the free floating are subjected to intervention only in exceptional circumstances. The major trading currency, including the US dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, and the euro, are freely floating currencies.
The euro, the most ambitious examples of freely floating arrangement that resulted in countries giving up their own currency to create a new one, is the euro. Not content with economic integration envisaged in the Single European Act. When we say envisage, it means contemplate or conceive of as a possibility or desirable future event. The EU nations signed the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, which sets steps to accomplish two goals which are political union and the monetary union. Political union is a type of state which is composed of or created out of smaller states. The process of creating such states of smaller states is called as unification. Unification of states that used to be together and the reuniting is referred to as a reunification. Second one is the monetary union. Monetary union, also known as currency union, an exchange rate regime when two or more countries use the same currency. The European Monetary System and the European Monetary Union. Monetary unity in Europe did not occur overnight. It began in 1979, when the European Monetary System was set up as a means of creating exchange rate stability within the European community. As a series of exchange relationships linked the currency of most members through a parity grid. Parity grid means determines the exchange rate at which naked intervention are necessary to maintain the peg to the European currency unit. As the countries narrowed the fluctuation in their exchange rates, that was set the stage for replacing the EMS with the exchange rate mechanism or ERM and full monetary union. According to the Treaty of Maastricht in 1972, countries had to meet certain criteria to comply with the ERM and be part of European Monetary Union or EMU. Termed the Stability and Growth Pact, the criteria outlined in the treaty which continue for Euro applicants today are: annual government deficit must not exceed 3% of GDP. Total outstanding government debt must not exceed 60% of GDP. Which means in order to adopt the euro, the EU countries have to bring their legislation in the line with relevant EU law and meet a specific condition designed to ensure economic convergence. Rate of inflation must remain being 1.5% of the three best performing EU countries. Average nominal long-term interest must be within 2% of the average rate in the three countries with the lowest inflation rate, and exchange rate stability must be maintained, meaning for the last 2 years or the least 2 years of the country concerned has kept within the normal fluctuation margins of the European exchange rate mechanism. The euro and the global financial crisis. Since the initial introduction of the euro, the currency has steadily grown in strength and importance. In mid-2008, it was trading at around $1.59. However, after Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in the US, with about 25,000 employees worldwide, filed for bankruptcy in September 2008. US stock markets dropped in value. At the same time, the euro fell because investors were pulling money out of the stock and putting it into safe haven currencies such as the Japanese yen and the US dollar. This was not helpful to the euro since the European economies were in serious financial problems. The role of the European Central Bank is to protect the euro against the ravages of inflation. When we say ravages, cause severe and extensive damage. And there's a lot of challenges. There are lack of uniform standards of fiscal regulation among member nations, their inability to adjust their own interest rates to counter inflation in a timely the depth of recession. The cultural differences within the Eurozone itself create conflict in issues such as labor, reform, and social welfare system, especially light on recent financial downturn. Determining exchange rate. The exchange rate regimes described earlier in the chapter are either fixed or floating with fixed rate, varying in terms of how fixed they are, and floating rate varying in terms of how much they actually float. Non-intervention currency in floating rate world, demand for a country's currency is a function of the demand for the country's goods and services and financial assets, where the currency price of nation is set by the forex market based on supply and demand related to the other currency.
Hello, today we're going to tackle all about intervention, which is in currency, in a fixed rate or managed floating rate world. So first one, the role of a central bank. So what is the role of a central banks? So central banks play a crucial role in ensuring economic and financial stability in a country. So they conduct a monetary policy to achieve a low and stable inflation. In the wake of the global financial crisis, central banks have expanded their toolkits to deal with risks to financial stability and to manage volatile exchange risks. They are responsible for overseeing the monetary system for a nation or a group of nations, along with a wide range of the other responsibilities such as holding reserves, assuring stability, and lending money. So next one is the central bank reserve assets. So first, let us define what is a reserve asset means. So reserve assets consist of those external assets that are readily available to and controlled by monetary authorities for direct financing of payment imbalances, for indirectly regulating the magnitude of such imbalances through intervention in exchange markets to affect the currency of exchange rate. So central bank reserve assets are kept in major forms such as foreign exchange assets, IMF-related assets, including SDRs and gold. So foreign exchange comprises over 90% of total reserves worldwide. So foreign exchange reserves are assets held on reserves by a central bank in foreign currencies, which means that these foreign exchange rates or currencies are adopted by foreign countries such as United States that has foreign currencies.
So these reserves are used to back liabilities and influence monetary policy. So next one is the IMF related assets that accounted for 3% of total international reserves at the end of 2018. So having strong central bank reserves assets is essential to a country's fiscal strength. So when the financial crisis in Asia, Russia, and South America hit in late 1990s, very few countries had strong central bank reserve assets. So that means that it is very important to have a strong foundation of reserve assets because based on that example, late in back late 1990s, they only had few countries that had strong foundation of central bank reserve assets. So that is why it is very important to have a strong foundation that we can adapt to in an exchange market countries or in an exchange market rates. So next one is how central banks intervene in the market. So intervene means to involve. So paano nga ba nag-involve or ano ba involvement ng central banks sa market? So central banks, especially those in developing countries, intervene in the foreign exchange market in order to build reserves for themselves or provide them to the country's banks. So as I've said earlier, usually ang mga merong foreign exchange reserve assets ay yung mga foreign countries that has foreign currency. So dito naman, ang central banks ay usually nag-grow or nag-a-adapt sa mga developing countries. So their aim is often to stabilize the exchange rate. Central banks may coordinate actions with other central banks or may make policy statements to influence markets and intervene to reverse, resist, or support a market trend. So central banks intervene in currency markets by buying and selling currency to affect its price. So next one is a different attitude toward intervention. So central banks generally agree that the primary objective of foreign exchange market intervention is to manage the volatility and or influence the level of the exchange rate. So governments prefer to stabilize the exchange rate because excessive short-term volatility erodes market confidence and affects both the financial market and the real goods market. So government policies change over time depending on the economic conditions and the attitude of the prevailing administration in power, irrespective of whether the currency is considered to be freely floating. So next one is the challenges with intervention. In general, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for intervention to have its lasting effect in the value of a currency, given the daily volume of foreign exchange transactions. No one government can move the market unless its movements can change market psychology. So meaning to say, hindi natin malalaman or hindi natin mahulaan kung gaano ba karami ang volume ng transaction or ang volume ng exchange foreign transaction ang mangyayari over a period of time. So yun yung isa sa factor na pwedeng mag-arise na challenges with intervention. So next one is the black market. A black market arises, however, when exchanges for foreign currency take place at an unofficial exchange rate, closely approximates a price based on supply and demand for a currency instead of a government-controlled place. So next one is the foreign exchange convertibility and controls. Foreign exchange controls are most often instituted by countries whose currencies are weak and whose citizens prefer to hold and use the currencies of other nations. Institution of foreign exchange controls hinders foreign investors who wish to extricate their funds. It is to assist in the removal of a balance of payments deficits and to control disruptive short-run capital flows that tend to destabilize the country's exchange rates.
Hard currency is a currency that is usually fully convertible and strong or relatively stable in value in comparison with other currencies. It means it is a currency of a strong nation that is not likely to depreciate suddenly. Example of hard currency is euro and dollars, while soft currency is one that is usually not fully convertible and is so called a weak currency. So it is a currency of a economically weak country, and also it is sensitive and easy to depreciate. People do not expect a soft currency to maintain its value over time compared to hard currencies. Controlling convertibility. To conserve scarce foreign exchange, some government impose exchange restriction on companies or individual who wants to exchange money. By convertibility of a currency, we mean currency of a country can be freely converted into foreign exchange at market. Determine rate of exchange, that is, exchange rate as determined by demand for and supply of a currency. In order to maintain exchange rate of their currencies in terms of dollars or gold, various countries impose several controls over the use of foreign exchange. This requires some restriction on the use of foreign exchange and its allocation among different uses. The currency of a nation was converted into foreign exchange on the basis of officially fixed exchange rate. In license, the government permits set the exchange rate by forcing all foreign currency recipients, exporters, and those who obtain foreign currency to sell it the official purchase rate to their central bank. The bank then sell the foreign currency it acquires by selling it at fixed rate to those who need to pay for essential goods overseas. An importer can only buy a foreign exchange if he has obtained an importer license for the product at issues. Multiple exchange rate. The government sets different exchange rate for different types of transaction. This is a system where a country will have both fixed and floating foreign exchange rates at the same time, and both can be used when exchanging currencies in that country. In this situation, the market is divided into any number of segments, each with its own exchanging rate. Import deposits. The government tightens the issue of import license and requires importers to make a deposit with the central bank, often for as long as 1 year and interest-free, covering the full price of manufactured goods they would purchase from abroad. This requires the importers to put some amount of money in an account for some period of time. The purpose may be to assure the import duties will be paid. If they apply all, or the deposit may simply be not tariff barrier intended to discourage imports. Quantity control. Government may also limit the amount of exchange through quantity controls, which often apply to tourism. A quantity control limits the amount of currency a local resident then purchase from the bank for foreign travel. The quantity control is an important aspect in the relationship with the supplier to ensure that all contractual obligations have been met at, and to prevent any possible disputes. A verification by an independent third party can save a lot of trouble in the long run. Exchange rate purchasing parity. Purchasing power parity is the rate at which the currency of one country would have to be converted into that of another country to be the same amount of goods and services in each country. This means the price of similar good is the same regardless of which currency one uses to buy the goods, since goods and services in each country are priced in their own currency. It is difficult to make a clear comparison of the price of a given good or services in two different countries. Exchange rate and interest rates. Fisher effect is the theory that the nominal rate is the real interest rate plus inflation, because the real interest rate should be the same in every country. The country with the higher rates should have the higher inflation. The Fisher effect is the economic theory created by economist Irving Fisher that described the relationship between inflation in both real and nominal interest rates. The Fisher effect states that the real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation rate. Therefore, the real interest rates fall as inflation increases unless nominal rates increase in the same rate as inflation. International Fisher effect implies the currency of the country with a lower interest rate will strengthen in the future. So, it is an economic principle that the projected gap between the exchange rates of two currencies is essential, equivalent to difference between the nominal interest rates of the countries. According to the IFE, countries with higher nominal interest rates experience higher rates of inflation, which will result in currency depreciation against the other currencies. Forecasting exchange rate movement. First, fundamental forecasting uses trends in economic variables to predict future exchange rate. So it is based on the fundamental relationship between economic variables and exchange rates. It may arise simply from subjective assessment of the factors that affect exchange rate. Second, technical forecasting. Use past trends in the exchange rate movement to spot future trends. So it involves uses of historical data to predict future values. This includes the statistical analysis time series model. Business implication of exchange rate changes. First, marketing decision. Marketing manager watch exchange rate because they can affect demand for economies product at home and abroad. Exchange rate refers to the value of the currency of one country to another country. Exchange rate might be sign of strangeness of the economy of a country. For example, if the exchange rate is higher for a certain country's currency, the country's economy is considered to be strong. Exchange rate affect the marketing decision of a company. There are numbers of reasons for it. Exchange rate may impact the prices and volumes of the imports that company makes to other countries. The prices of the product are not necessarily standard and in one currency in the whole of the world. Therefore, the manager should be cautious when they are predicting exchange rate. Production decision. Companies might locate production in a weak currency country because initially investment there is relatively cheap. Such a country is a good base for an expensive exportation. Exchange rate changes affect production decision. For example, manufacturer in a country where wages and operating expenses are higher might be implemented to locate production in a country with a currency that is rapidly losing value. The company's currency would buy significant amount of a weak currency, making the company's initial investment cheaper. Furthermore, goods manufactured in the country would be relatively cheap in world markets. Financial decision. Exchange rate can influence sourcing of financial resources, the cross-border remittance of funds, and the reporting of financial results. In this area, a company might be tempted to borrow money where interest rates are lowest in deciding about cross-borders financial flows. A company would want to convert local currency into home country currency when Exchange rates are most favorable so that it can maximize its return. However, countries with weak currency often have currency control, making it difficult for multinational enterprises to do so. Finally, exchange rate changes can influence the reporting of financial results.